Ooh. I gotta be tough. Take the blanket off so I can record. Okay. It's really not that cold. I think it's 52 right now. Alrighty, the last I left you with this shop building series, the spray foam insulation had just been sprayed in. And let me tell you, walking around the space at this point is drastically different. Not only the acoustics, but also being able to not see through the walls really started giving me a feel for each individual space. So after spending some time daydreaming, I started on the next big task. I wanted to install the ceiling before sheathing the walls so that the walls can butt directly up to the ceiling material. However, I had a day before the material was arriving and didn't want to waste the day, so I got started on the 2 bottom rows of the walls. My old shop had OSB walls, and I loved having the ability to drive in a screw anywhere in order to hang things. For this space, I wanted to stick with wood, but instead of OSB, I went with plywood. And to keep things looking a little bit nicer, I went with sanded 3/4 inch plywood. 3/4 inch is a little overkill. However, I simply could not find 1/2 inch ply in anything other than construction grade. So 3/4 inch it is. On this partition wall, I was in such a hurry on the other side to get it sheathed for the spray foam guys that I just started throwing up plywood and didn't account that the ends weren't landing on a stud. To fix this, I added in some additional blocking to give me some meat to screw into, but when I moved to the other walls, I made sure to cut all of my first sheets in order to land straight on a stud and avoid all of this together. So the very bottom row is definitely the most time consuming, as it's the one with all the outlets. But the second row was extremely simple, as the bottom row acts as a shelf to set it on. If there's a downside to the number of outlets I put in, it is sheathing the walls, because every single one had to be cut around, of course. Brian and I tried a few hacks to see if the process could be sped up or made simpler, but honestly we found the fastest and most accurate way was to simply pull a tape. For my walls, I am using a carpenter's pencil to act as a spacer so that the plywood is not touching the concrete. So when pulling the vertical measurements, we made sure to butt the tape measure against a pencil as well. I would then take those measurements and mark them on a sheet of plywood, then use a sheetrock square to form the box's outline. I used a large spiral bit to punch a hole and then a jigsaw to completely cut it out. Then when actually placing it on the wall, we would lay down 2 carpenter's pencils for the spacing, then butt it up to the previous board and secure it to the studs with screws. A nailer would definitely speed up the process here. However, I stuck with screws to make taking down these panels easier in case I ever want to replace one or need access to the inside of the wall. After attaching the top screws, I would use a level to transfer the location down to the bottom, just to keep things looking tidy and in line. However, I quickly switched over to using a square to speed this up. And you'll notice that I am not staggering my seams. This is just a personal choice, as I think it looks better. Staggered joints provides more strength, but since the integrity of my walls is already built up, I went with what I liked best aesthetically. We were able to work until we ran out of plywood, was just about completed the bottom 2 rows over on the woodworking side. The next day, the ceiling material did arrive, but there was another matter that completely stole my attention. The previous night, we had a huge storm come in, and another large system was moving in quickly. Whenever I got down to the shop, there were 2 areas that had standing water inside the shop. It's difficult to express all of the feelings that shot through me, but shock and frustration, panic, definitely were at the top of that list. It isn't as bad as it looks though. The grading outside makes it difficult for water to run away from the shop, and so much had collected that it rose above the level of the slab and seeped under the bottom plate of the walls. The south end of the shop has a sumped area that filled with water and acted as kind of a pond, so that the water's easiest escape route was around the back of the shop and off to the north. Water coming down faster than it could run off, of course, created a problem. Dirt work and grading has always been a part of the plan, but to temporarily fix it until I can get to it, Cody hopped on the tractor and trenched a path to allow the pond on the south end to completely empty. It was extremely disappointing at the time, but honestly, things weren't that bad. I only had to remove about 6 sheets of plywood to allow them and the insulation behind them to fully dry out. So again, to not waste time, with that happening on the woodworking side, I moved over to the metalworking side in order to start on the ceiling. For my ceiling, I chose to not go with drywall, but instead a material that I haven't seen used before, but I think it will look pretty darn cool. It's a corrugated polycarbonate material that I've used on previous projects before, but this time I went with the color silver so that it will look like a tin metal ceiling. I contemplated trying to do this step off ladders, and thank goodness I was talked out of it. These panels are light, but it was still an extreme 3-day workout putting up the ceiling, and the scissor lift was 100% worth renting. The panels are 14 feet long and around 2 feet wide. I started at the back of the building so that when entering the shop through the porch, I won't see the side laps. Then I also started at the left of the space so that the head laps will also be mostly hidden when standing at the same spot. And no, that's not me doing a weird version of a happy dance. That is me trying to shake out the screaming of my shoulders and arms. Because even with lightweight material in the lift, this was a marathon of a workout. So something I wish I would have put more thought into before starting is handling the very end piece, which ended up being about 1/4 of a panel. So it was 2 full sheets and then a partial to complete a full row. The seam didn't land on a truss and therefore didn't come out as clean and unnoticeable as I would like. It's also right in line with the eye when walking into this space. At the end of the day, it's fine. And since there's nothing I can do about it, I took it as a lesson, changed things up as I moved to do the woodworking side next. Of course, I first reattached these 6 panels on the wall that I had taken down to let dry out. But then I laid out 3 full panels of the ceiling material on the ground. This allowed me to play with the spacing of the head laps and work out the look it will have on the ceiling once installed. I didn't worry about landing on the seams and trusses here. Instead, I just made the laps equal. I once again started at the back, but this time I started at the far right, so that whenever I enter into the main entrance, again it will look seamless. The panels are attached directly to the bottom cord of the trusses with some hex head screws. And a tip for the very first row, it does make life easy if you mark the truss locations on your top plate before attaching the panel. And while this job can be done with 2 people, it is far easier with 3. We worked out a system where Cody and I stayed on the lift and Brian moved around as the ground man, passing up the next panel and supporting the far end of the current one from a ladder. We contemplated getting 2 lifts at one point, but honestly, I think 1 lift and a ladder is the best approach. I think 2 lifts would probably just get in each other's way, especially with my driving. I'm not lying. I'm a very bad lift driver. 3 screws per truss were used, and now that I'm saying that, I should have calculated how many screws total it took for the job. But regardless, it was a lot. Our system would be for Cody to stick the far right squarely up against the wall, while Brian and I kept the overlap corrugation seated nice and tight. Then we would secure all of the screws on the first row where that overlap was, before doing the second row. Then the same thing, driving in all of the second row screws before driving in all of the final and third row. This kept the panel from being able to pull and shrink as it was being attached, and therefore knocking it out of square. So instead of driving in the screws 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, it would be all of this row, then all of the middle row, then all of the third row. That way you're pulling across the panel and hopefully stretching it evenly. I hope that makes sense. On that note, it's also a good idea to, once you have up a row, to look down it before you move the lift down so that you can see if you need to compensate at all. When getting to the headlap, I would make sure to tuck the end of the current panel under the previous row just to keep things uniformed. Other things that helped with uniformity in the end is paying attention that the seams are lining up nice and straight, and that the corrugations are seating nice and snugly to the previous panel. Now, way back in the framing step, George and I used a bunch of scrap 2x6s to make what's called nailers to the top of the partition wall and both of the gable ends. The only purpose of these boards is to give you a way to attach the ceiling. They provide a lip of material to secure the ceiling paneling to. Oh, about outlets. I first tried locating the box's location on the panel with a tape measure like the walls as it was going up, then using a rotary tool to cut it out. And this did work, but it was difficult and time consuming. Since this material has a lot of flex to it, it is by far easier to place the panel directly over the outlets and then come back to cut it out after securing it. Oh, and then I guess the last tip I sort of have from my experience is the very last row. The last row was made up of only a few corrugations, and instead of going over the previous panel like the rest of the ceiling, we secured the first row of screws, but then left the panel like flop down so that the last panel, which we left as a complete full panel, could be slipped under it and then all attached as one. This not only was a workaround for having to rip a sheet down, but also created a very seamless look, as it looks just like one panel if you look straight up at it. Okay, with the ceiling in, it was back to the walls. My walls are 12 feet, so 3 rows of 4x8 plywood fit perfectly. In fact, before laying down the first row at the bottom, I measured the entire span to get a fix on the distance so that I could make sure the spacer I was using wouldn't mean that I had to rip down every single sheet up at the top. As I said, I used a carpenter's pencil down at the bottom. Doing the plywood is a big step. However, I was really surprised at just how quick and easy it went. Brian used one of those sheet handling handles to make carrying a full sheet by himself easier, which means that as Cody and I were securing the current sheet, he could be grabbing the next one. And also, having the previous row laid down and therefore acting as a shelf was a huge benefit. Then also throw in that almost none of these top sheets needed any cutting. It's a little deceiving having 2 spaces because we'd get to the end of one of these major steps, either the ceiling or the walls, and feel very accomplished and of course worn out. And then it's like, okay, let's move over to this other side and do it from scratch once again. But that's exactly what we did. After finishing the woodworking side, we then did the exact same process over to the metalworking side. And just to kind of give you a gauge on time, we were able to knock out this entire space in just a single day's time. Granted, the boys were calling me a drill sergeant by the end of the day, but hey, we got it done. I thought it was absolutely crazy walking around after the spray foam insulation, but having the ceiling and the walls done is nothing other than surreal. It is 2 huge steps that have a drastic impact on the space's look and feel. I have spent so much time over the past few days just sitting in a fold-out chair, looking around and enjoying the space. I cannot tell y'all how worn out I am, but I think it's officially safe to say that I am in the home stretch. Next up will be wiring in the outlets, installing the lights, and definitely needs a sound system. I also need to deck the underside of the porch, so y'all stay tuned. Oh. Could you push this in? No, that doesn't work.